Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
Hi, my name's David Hanna. I'm the author of Broken Icarus. My new book is about the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, Aviation and the Rise of Fascism. You're listening to the Dr. Sky Experience on 77 WABC.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the exciting Dr. Sky Experience on America's iconic radio station, Talk Radio 77 WABC, out of New York City and around the world. The Dr. Sky Experience has great interviews from the realms of astronomy, space, aviation, and weather, with celebrity guests in the mix, and as an added bonus, great guests from the realms of American exceptionalism as we continue to talk about truth, justice, and the American way. And to make all that happen, we're privileged and honored to have our producer as part of this particular program, Dr. D. Richard Dugan, who makes it all happen. Sit back and relax, ladies and gentlemen, a very special guest today. In just a moment, a brief introduction of our author and guest, David Hanna, a brand new Prometheus Books book entitled Broken Icarus. The 1933 Chicago World's Fair, the Golden Age of Aviation, and the Rise of Fascism. But a brief introduction of our special guest is in order. David Hanna was raised on the coast of Maine. He teaches history at Stuyvesant High School in New York, and he is a recipient of the New York Times Teachers Make a Difference Award and the University of Chicago's Outstanding Educator Award. In addition, in today's book, he's also the proud author of Knights of the Sea, Rendezvous with Death, and he's here today to talk about this iconic book that's so timely today, especially if you're a fan of aviation and American history. A little backtrack on the book and sideline goes like this. In the 1930s, they still conjure painful images, the Great Want of the Depression, and overseas, the exuberant crowds motivated by self-appointed national saviors dressing up old hatreds as new ideas. But there was another story that embodied mankind in that decade. In the same year that both Adolf Hitler and Franklin D. Roosevelt came to power, the city of Chicago staged what was, up to that time, the most forward-looking international exhibition in history. That is the 1933 World's Fair. It looked to the future, unabashedly, as one of the full glowing promise of the future. That particular exhibition, A Century of Progress. And here to tell us about that is David Hanna. David, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for being with us.
It's my pleasure, Dr. Sky.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this is a fascinating book, and yes, I did read the book from cover to cover, and who wouldn't want to, because it has so much great information here. And of course, as you know, we've spoken before this interview, what great interest we both share in the world of aviation and in history. But tell us the power behind this and the motivation for writing the book. It's so timely for those that are interested in aviation, but let's hear what you have to say. How did it all evolve?
Well, it was partly an interest that I had in World's Fair since I was very young. I just found them fascinating. And this particular World's Fair was one that was, as you earlier referenced, was particularly forward-looking. Really the first of the World's Fairs to be so forward-looking. If you think about television series like Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, or for instance, the animated series, The Jetsons, you can see a direct line back to the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. And then, of course, there's the experimental prototype City of Tomorrow, Epcot, that was built by Disney in Florida. And so, which really fascinates me. And so that was part of it. The other part was the 30s, looking at this period, because the period we generally associate with the road to World War II, all that entails, which is
yes.
a pretty dark chapter in world history. But there's this moment, sort of just before everything sort of goes wrong, if you will, where that was still out there in the future. No one knew. They didn't know that was necessarily the case. There certainly was a feeling. Hitler had been in power for a few months at that point, and there was a feeling that Hitler was going to have to be confronted in some way. But again, the idea of going to war, I don't think that was on people's minds at the time. And so there's that element. And then in terms of aviation, for me, it was the most logical way to approach trying to explain the fair to people, because it was explicitly promoted by the fair as the main motif. If you look at, for instance, the main promotional poster, it features seaplanes, it has zeppelins, it has balloons ascending to the stratosphere, because they knew, as they had already set up the calendar, that they were going to have events featuring aviation and these attempts to reach the stratosphere spaced out over a period of time in the fair's calendar, and that was going to be the sort of the common thread that what pulled it all together for people. And it was something that was still it was still a wonder of it all element that I think today we lack. We check in, we go through security, we get on our plane, we're flying from New York to Chicago, and we don't really think much of it. But that we weren't there quite yet at that point. And so it was very exciting for people.
Well, David, as we go into this particular story here, I just want to bring up a little bit of let's go back in the time capsule kind of thing here. Let's imagine that we're going back and doing a little promo for this particular event, just to put people in the right mindset as we explore with you, the author, some of the great details of how this came about. So we'll say it this way. Folks, come to the World's Fair in Chicago, a century of progress, May the 27th to November the 1st. How about this? Adults, 50 cents, and children, 25 cents. But even though that's not a super promo, it still tells a lot. But the picture is worth more than 1,000 words.
The $1 Million Hall of Science shown here is the central building of Chicago's 1933 World's Fair. Its outstanding feature is the optical illusion tower, which gives the impression of being a real skyscraper, although actually it is only 100 feet high. This building also stresses the modern in architecture. Its main entrance is designed along modernistic lines, which will focus attention on a center fountain to be illuminated by reflected light. Here is a replica of Fort Dearborn, reconstructed from the plans of Captain Whistler, who originally built it on the site from which modern Chicago grew. This is the administration building, another modernistic marvel, where all business pertaining to the fair will be handled. And now you see the Travel and Transport building. Its unique feature is the roof, a dome suspended by steel cables. On June 1st, 1933, the World's Fair will open, dedicated to a century of progress.
It's just so amazing. I'm looking here inside the cover of this particular book of yours, and these posters are just so outstanding. This Art Deco off the charts. I just love it. And I'm definitely going to get a poster like this and put it in my office someday. I just love that era. But David, let's talk a little bit more about this. Let's talk about how this particular fair got started. It's not easy to do a World's Fair. And then later, I want to talk a little bit about the connection to astronomy, because maybe I've said this incorrectly to some of my audience when we do the astronomy programs about a certain star in the heavens and its connection to this fair. But talk about how the whole fair got started. Who was behind it? How did it get funded? And why was it so successful? I understand it was one of the first profitable World's Fairs of all time. Am I right?
Yes. Well, it's interesting because the timing. We look back at it. It's happening right in the middle of the Depression. These were pretty rough times, to say the least. But it was planned during the Roaring '20s when there were times of plenty. And so that's important to note, to put on a fair of this size, it took years to put that together. But what had happened was that there was a mixed reception in City Hall for having a fair. They were willing to endorse it, but they weren't really interested in diverting any funds for it.
I see.
And the big civic boosters in the city, well-connected Chicagoans, like, for instance, Rufus Dawes and his brother Charles Dawes, decided that's how we want to do it. So they decided that it's going to be strictly a private sector run fair. And for those of your listeners who feel that it's better to, let the government get out of the way and let the private sector do it, I mean, this is an example of something that really did work. I mean, it really that held up really well. Now, one of the interesting things is that generation of leaders in Chicago, one of their main experiences as adults was the World War I. And World War I, one of the reasons why the United States contribution was so effective was because we were, in that era, very interested in efficiency. It was something that was the watchword for the time in business and in industry. And they had been involved in purchasing materials and oversight for the American Expeditionary Force in France. And they hired this guy named Lennox Lohr, who was a real can-do, efficient, dynamic guy with tremendous energy, who knew exactly they were all. That's the thing about it; they were all on the same page. You didn't have a lot. Once they decided what they were going to do, there was not a lot of in terms of falling out, just disagreement. They were working towards the same goal, and Lennox Lohr was absolutely the right guy to get this done, to see it through. Now, what he did with the Dawes' connections, both in business and politics, and then his own can-do know-how from his experience during World War I, was to reach out to private businesses. So, for instance, like a GE or a Westinghouse or a Chrysler Corporation or Ford, and convince them that what they should do, instead of having their separate promotional pavilions, that they should feature basically their industry and all work together to show the best of their industry in the most forward-looking light.
Yes.
To create, I guess you could say, cooperative sort of by industry. And that was one of the things that made it very successful and very exciting. And it also ties back to what you had mentioned about the way that the fair literally started with this kind of a publicity stunt, but a way of showing the power of technology to harness, for instance, light from a star that is thousands of light years away.
Well, I'd like to get into that, but I want to mention to everybody listening, you are listening to the Dr. Sky Experience with me, Dr. Sky. We're on America's iconic radio station, yes, Talk Radio 77 WABC in New York City and around the world. We're here, of course, not only on the air, but also on WABCRadio.com, where you can, of course, follow us on our podcast and our blog reports here on great subjects like astronomy, space, aviation, and weather, celebrity guests in the mix, and stories about American exceptionalism as we continue to talk about truth, justice, and the American way. And fitting right into this mold, I mean, perfectly, in my opinion, is author David Hanna, a brand new book, Broken Icarus, the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, the Golden Age of Aviation, and the Rise of Fascism, a Prometheus Books book that, yes, ladies and gentlemen, you can get just about anywhere. I encourage you to do that. But let's talk a little bit more in the time we have here, David. This is just fascinating as you're bringing us into the enlightenment of how the fair got started. Talk a little bit more. Let's start off with this Italian aviator that I think really rocks the world, and he does something amazing. This individual, Italo Balbo. Talk about him and what did he bring to Chicago, but a little bit more about him, and also maybe on the dark side, talk a little bit about the rise of fascism that's starting to evolve in the world, not only with Hitler, but Mussolini, and the story of Italo Balbo.
Aviation's greatest feat of that year was the mass flight of an Italian air armada to the Chicago World's Fair. General Italo Balbo led his fleet of 24 giant seaplanes, landing in flawless array. On the 6,100-mile return flight to Orvieto, Italy, he paused to receive a hero's welcome from New York City. Millions jammed lower Broadway to cheer Balbo, his 96 officers and men, perhaps the most effective goodwill ambassadors from Italy during Mussolini's entire reign.
Well, Italo Balbo was part of that. He was somebody who was a veteran of World War I. He eventually joined up with the black shirts in Italy. That led to the rise of Mussolini, who was the first fascist dictator. The fascists saw their movement essentially as an antidote to communism. The Bolshevik Revolution had happened in Russia, and it scared a lot of people at the time. And they also they were either impatient or unimpressed with liberal democracy. They felt that it was weak. They weren't, they especially in countries like, for instance, Italy and Germany, where there was a lot of turmoil after World War One. They weren't stable countries like our own, and that has a lot to do with it. But what happened is one of his rewards for backing Mussolini was to become the head of the Aeronautica, the Italian Air Force, and he eventually becomes a advocate of. Instead of having, like, say, the Charles Lindbergh, the Lone Eagle with his remarkable transatlantic crossing in 1927, he wants to organize large groups of planes to make cruises. And he does this to around the Mediterranean, eventually across the South Atlantic to Brazil. But the most ambitious was these 24 Savoia Marchetti seaplanes, these giant seaplanes that were going to cross the North Atlantic after sort of jumping over from Iceland and then to Labrador and then go up the St. Lawrence, cross the Great Lakes, and then descend on Lake Michigan. Of course, obviously they couldn't do this all in one shot.
And it's no easy feat, by the way. I mean, this is tremendous in the time we're talking about. Even today, for that type of airplane, it's not
It really
easy,
is. It's very dangerous. Yeah, it was quite dangerous. And I said the thing about all of these aviators.
Llévate más de lo que esperas todos los días con el nuevo McValue en McDonald's. Ahora puedes comprar uno y sumarle otro por $1. Así que cuando tu equipo favorito enfrente a sus rivales, enfrenta tus antojos con $5 Meal Deals. Y si estás corriendo para alcanzar el desayuno, corre al app para llevarte ofertas antes del cutoff. Tú decides, y con McValue, tu decisión siempre rinde más. Precios y participación pueden variar. BOGO $1 válido para un producto de igual o menor valor. Debe estar registrado en Rewards para ofertas en el app.
And I guess you could say that those that anticipate, the space race, is that to a large degree they were making this up as they went along, And but somebody has to. That's the thing. Somebody has to be the pioneer, or we wouldn't benefit with our ability to, for instance, like I said, just jet from city to city without thinking much about it. Somebody had to do this. And this was at a time, by the way, it was interesting. It wasn't clear that the airplane landing on hard ground with wheels was going to be the mode. Many thought that the seaplane was a better option, landing on water. And, of course, there were the Zeppelins. But anyway, when Balbo came, he was just such a sensation. He was a tremendously charismatic guy. And it was the city it was just euphoric, the reception that he received. People talking about how beautiful it was seeing these planes land in precision formation on Lake Michigan on a beautiful summer day. And he was able to, he liked people. That also helped.
That sure does, right?
And so, and then they felt that. And it's interesting because he was a fascist, and for instance, socialists were up in arms about the fact that he was being welcomed because they battled in the streets of Italy in the 1920s. And he, it's interesting because he was never comfortable, for instance, when Mussolini started kind of getting close to Hitler, and he warned against it. And he was certainly not willing to parrot the anti-Semitic line. He explicitly said that has no part of that in his vision of Italian identity. But he was a black shirt, and when we look back, and it's interesting, I've seen, clips of the planes over Chicago's skyline, and you see all of them in formation, and you hear the propellers roaring, and we know, of course, World War II is coming in. A lot of times when we hear that, we think, oh, gosh.
Well, I read in between the lines there, David. I read in between the lines that I feel the great, dislike, if not, I hate the word hatred, between Mussolini and Balbo as he becomes such a hero to the people. In other words, the jealousy factor with Mussolini is off the charts, as I read well in the book. Am I correct?
Yeah, it was really hard for Balbo to walk the fine line because the more success he had, then the more that caused a rift with he and Mussolini. Mussolini eventually packed him off to an Italian colony in North Africa, and in some ways it was the best thing that ever happened to Balbo because he was sort of out of commission as things started to go in the really bad direction. But he wound up getting shot down by friendly fire at the very beginning of the war in North Africa. But he really did. He was really quite a character. But it's controversial even today in Chicago. I've talked to people. There's a street, really quite a nice street that leads down to the lake, and they've talked about, well, should we change it since Balbo Drive? Should we change it because he was a fascist?
Sure.
It seems that at the time, and I think even to a degree today, I think Chicagoans differentiate between him and Mussolini, and I think they'll probably. I would be surprised if they were to change that street name. But of course, it's up to Chicagoans. It's certainly not up to me.
Absolutely. And now with the tearing it down of many statues across the country, I mean, this is something that I'm sure is on people's minds that are very sensitive to things like this. This is quite fascinating, David, as we talk about this. But what I wanted to shift gears on is something from the world of astronomy, which is even more to me, I don't know, just so amazing. I read about this a long time ago. Let's go back. Dateline, May 27th, 1933. A telescope is set along the shores of Lake Michigan to open up the World's Fair, and in tribute to the star, which we all know in the world of astronomy is Arcturus, this orange-red supergiant star, obviously a distance now of about 40 light years away. Symbology is what? That the starlight that left in 1893, the last of the great fairs, this starlight opened up the World's Fair. I want to hear more about this because I don't know much about it, but I'm fascinated about it. Very much accurate, correct? That's what they did.
Yeah, that's about right. May 27th was opening day, and they had a big crowd. But then at night, once it started to get dark, closer towards, I guess, getting on towards 9, they had a planned event, and the event was to capture the light from Arcturus. And GE and Westinghouse had collaborated with some of the top university research scientists who were working in astronomy and also in the field of electronics. And the one of the things that was also interesting about it was that 40 years you just mentioned, because everybody who would have been of a certain age at that time in Chicago would have remembered that 40 years prior had been the famous 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the White City. And so the idea that this light that was traveling towards Earth took 40 years to reach us had been generated by this giant red-orange star on the sort of the halo of the Milky Way.
Amazing.
That was something that they had promoted, that there's this 40 years, as you said, and so that it's it's connecting back to the city's own heritage with its first fair, and so they harnessed the light, and there are these photoelectric cells that essentially captured the light, and they used it to then essentially light up this fountain. They called it a lagoon, but it was actually it's like a little sort of arm of the lake in between Northerly Isle and the lakefront, and they had this magnificent rainbow-colored light show that started up, which people loved. And it's interesting because if you go to Epcot every evening, they have in this central pool the same type of Technicolor light show. Walt Disney had visited the 1933 Chicago World's Fair and was very interested in a lot of both the scientific, futuristic exhibits, and then also the midway. There was actually a mock Belgian town and so forth. And so anyway, there's a direct connection. But then it lit it up, and people just were thrilled by it. And also there was a lot of neon used for the first time. Joseph Urban was this set designer who was a genius. He actually never got to see it because he died, but he had
what a shame.
Planned everything so you'd have this neon using essentially light as architecture. And this was all lit up. And what they did, people loved it so much that they went through the same process of harnessing this light from Arcturus every night. And so this was so popular. And the Adler Planetarium, if you know Chicago, you're in Chicago listening, of course, that still exists. That was
I've been
on
there.
The fairgrounds.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, David,
so
this is just a fascinating story because, I just envy that. I mean, the time period, neon, starlight, the most amazing exhibits. Your story as we continue to move through time and space. David Hanna, our guest, here on the Dr. Sky Experience as we talk about great stories, ladies and gentlemen, and a great book, Broken Icarus, the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, the golden age of aviation and the rise of fascism. I'm moving fast forward here, but my gosh, I want to learn so much about this, and so do our listeners. The big era of Zeppelins and a man that I'm so fascinated by. I want just tell us everything you possibly can in this short interview. Hugo Echner, a real genius of the aircraft that we call lighter than air, the Zeppelin. Describe him and his creations there in Germany. I mean, this is a fascinating story.
That famous old German dirigible, the Graf Zeppelin, comes rolling up from Rio. She stops at Miami on her way from the Argentine, a hop of over 4,000 miles. This is her fourth flight to America, and she has flown 275,000 miles all over the globe. So she knows her way about, and she certainly knows how to land. Her veteran commander, Dr. Echner, comes down the ladder and is greeted by Florida officials. Dr. Echner piloted the Graf Zeppelin around the world in 1929 and has successfully flown 17,000 persons on more than 250 flights. A brief rest, and then she's off again on her way to Chicago, where she circles over the World's Fair. She takes a look at the sky ride and on over the planetarium. Finally, after a complete survey of the exhibition, the giant airship lands again, once more with the utmost ease and grace. In fact, she makes it look easy.
Hugo Echner was a real Renaissance man. He had many interests, and actually he had earned his PhD not in engineering or aviation like you might think, but actually in the humanities, social sciences rather. But what happened was he got a job as basically like a PR guy for the original Zeppelin company, which was founded by this old German officer named Ferdinand von Zeppelin. Mm-hmm. And eventually he fell in love with the whole project. And then he wanted to learn how to actually pilot them and design them. So he went from PR into actually piloting them and designing them. And he became the real face of the Zeppelin. It was more than just a type of aviation. It was almost like a movement, because Zeppelins represented this magical, wondrous, he called it a silvery fish, that would come out of the clouds, that would connect all of mankind. He, in 1929, went on an around-the-world tour that was sponsored by William Randolph Hearst, to show the Zeppelin to peoples from all over the world, peoples who would have been familiar with them, peoples who probably thought they were from outer space, who had no idea. It's a pretty remarkable story. He saw it as something that would connect people. And the Graf Zeppelin, Graf meaning count, was the non plus ultra in Zeppelin travel at that time. It was already involved in passenger service between Europe and Brazil.
Well, this is amazing, David, because you're talking about something almost 800 feet long, and we've all seen Goodyear blimps, and of course, in that particular World's Fair in 1933, they even had one, as you describe in the book. But it's so amazing. I almost imagine the startling phenomenon that would give the senses if you even saw the thing. And knowing that, as I talked to you off air about this, I said that apparently it came across, and you accurately described it because you're the historian, that the obvious thing is it came from, let's say, from Los Angeles, moving again back east. It probably came across where I am in Arizona, I believe, in 1929. And could you imagine people in the outer, in farmlands and in rural areas, seeing something like that? You're right. It would look like some kind of a spaceship from another world. But what I'm trying to describe, and have you described better, flying and maintaining this was not an easy task. I mean, it was all subjected to the winds. I mean, you really didn't have much control over this. So it was a little bit of luck, I guess, but also great, piloting on behalf of Hugo and his staff. Describe this. It's just amazing.
Well, it's interesting. Echner said that it's not like you pilot it or drive it. He said essentially that you sort of voyage. It's like he saw it as almost like a sea type of, the kind of knowledge you needed at sea would be the kind of knowledge that you would bring to bear, particularly with the weather. It's interesting because he was from Denmark. He was from actually a part of Germany that had been part of Denmark just before he was just before he was born, rather. Yes. And so he always talked about, that he had this sort of Viking blood. He spent a lot of time as a young boy out on the Baltic Sea sailing by himself. And he really got a sense of the weather. This is a guy who had an uncanny understanding of the weather. And that was crucial in his success. Because, quite frankly, these types of giant airships, particularly with, of course, hydrogen instead of helium in their cells that kept them aloft. It was just asking in many ways for a really tragic event like what happened with the Hindenburg in Lakehurst, New Jersey. It was really, like I said, a kind of a dicey proposition, and it wasn't just luck. I think there was, again, this element of understanding the weather in a way that in many ways, this is somewhat problematic. There were other fine Zeppelin captains. He wasn't the only one. But in many ways, he was essential to the whole project. And to make it work, to make it be viable as a passenger service, you can't depend on one person. And that, I think, was ultimately one of the problems. But Eckener, there's also another thing. I actually I went to the Zeppelin company in Friedrichshafen, Germany, and my wife and I went up in the current Zeppelin, which is the Zeppelin NT. This is more of a day trip kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It was wonderful. They're in the foothills of the Alps. But I talked to one of the most experienced pilots of airships, both Zeppelins, the smaller Zeppelins now, and of course the blimps, which we're all familiar with. And he said that it really was basically kind of lucky in many respects. He really was kind of lucky in some respects. Sure. That, in his opinion, these types of ships are not meant to be brought across oceans. And again, this is a guy who really admires Hugo Eck, knows a lot about him. The Zeppelin company prominently features him in their promotional film that all the passengers watch before they go off on their day trips. Yes. But he felt that it was really pushing it to do that. And I thought that was interesting coming from him, because this is something that's his life's work.
Well, what's amazing to me, David, is that when they had passenger service, I mean, there's descriptions of flying to South America or other places around the world. I mean, here you have this gondola that has areas where people can sleep. You have hot water. They're actually cooking with fire, and above them are these giant flammable gas bags. And yet the description that the people had on this, and I'm sure in those days they paid primo, it'd be like flying or going onto a luxurious cruise ship today, the top accommodation, first class and beyond. But the point is, it did have the capability of transporting people, and even over the ocean, there was some near disasters where some of the coverings ripped off, and yes, Hugo knew how to maintain this, and lucky for him and lucky for the ship, the Zeppelin, it made it through these storms. But they could have seriously just crashed into the ocean for the less capable piloting.
Yeah, and it was, again, particularly if you look at the North Atlantic crossings. But, it's interesting, though, when you look at the South Atlantic crossings to Brazil, that service never had any major mishaps, and it was eventually discontinued just because after what happened with the Hindenburg at Lakehurst, because just the imagery of that, that newsreel was seen by so many people, and it was just sort of assumed that, certainly without helium anyway, no one was in their right mind was going to book passage on a Zeppelin after seeing that film. Of course. Which is so unforgettable. I'm sure you've seen it. I mean,
it's horrible.
So iconic,
Well, let's go back in time here, not to rush it, but let's go back to October 26, 1933, something that I never knew. And folks, when you get to read David's book, you'll get the full skinny on it. The Zeppelin itself, the Graf, actually came to the Chicago World's Fair, but a little bit of controversy, I think you can describe better. At this particular time, one side of the vessel itself, or the airship, the Zeppelin, was emblazoned with the swastika, and the other side was not. Tell us about that story, because it actually came over Chicago. This is amazing. I never knew that at all.
At Capella University, you can learn at your own pace with our FlexPath learning format. Take 1 or 2 courses at a time and complete as many as you can in a 12-week billing session. With FlexPath, you can even finish the bachelor's degree you started in 22 months for $20,000. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu. Fastest 25% of students. Cost varies by pace, transfer credits, and other factors. Fees apply.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting story, and I wasn't able to get anything, definitive enough. Let's put it that way. So there's one interpretation of events, essentially this, that Hugo Eckener intentionally, when he piloted the craft, he was coming from Akron, Ohio, which was Zeppelin Goodyear headquarters here in the United States. coming to the fair, that early morning, the idea was to make a big swing around Chicago, so like sort of the west side, and then go up to the northern part of the city, do more. And then he left the craft, and his number 2 then piloted it back to Akron, and he stayed in the city and promoted the Zeppelin project, and did it in such a way that you couldn't see the side with the swastikas. And again, this is pretty compelling. There's pretty compelling evidence about this. On the other hand, there are other sources that say that that's not what happened. He did the sort of more direct route right on the lakefront, and then came back down. Though, without getting into too much detail, I think it's one of these things where it's probably better if they read the section of the book, because there's a lot of minutia. And I'll tell you, I dug into everything from wind directions that morning and all kinds
did a great job.
Newspapers. And it was hard to pin it down. But I will say this, is that I did have the opportunity to interview his grandson, Dr. Uwe Echner, who lives in Switzerland now. And he said that he knew his grandfather, and he said that his grandfather said that he'd done that previously, earlier in 1933, over other cities. And that was what got my attention. In other words, it wasn't a one-off, because he was flying the Graf Zeppelin in 1933. Hitler came to power in early 33. Joseph Goebbels Hitler was not a fan of the Zeppelins, but Joseph Goebbels saw them as this great opportunity to spread Nazi propaganda. And so Echner was constantly trying to keep his distance from them. And eventually this was a battle he lost, because as long as he wanted to stay in Germany, you either had to sort of play ball to a degree or you had to leave.
Absolutely.
But in the beginning, he was such a celebrity, Echner himself, that he was able to kind of use that to keep them at bay for a while. And really, Chicago in the fall of 1933 was really the last time he was really a free agent, in the sense that he could do something that he on his own to make kind of a quiet statement. Is like, I'm not on board with what's going on back in my home country. I love my country, but this isn't what I want it to be. And so, I find it to be very believable. And again, there are reports from other sources that, who are actually, one in particular who was on the Zeppelin that morning, who said this, that is exactly what happened. It's interesting because there was in Chicago itself, there was a very strong, large German-American community. Oh, yeah. And most of them were not very thrilled with Hitler, to say the least. And so they were there to greet Echner, and they had insisted to the fair that the Nazi swastika not fly anywhere at the fair. And mostly, the biggest group actually that was most important in this were actually German-American women. They insisted that this does not represent us. We don't want this, and they won. The swastika never flew at the fair. And they backed actually a Jewish Jewish-American group in Chicago of another women's group, and showing solidarity with them. And so Echner was interesting, because when he had to go to Chicago, he got invited to all the whirlwind of dinners. The same thing happened to Babel. It just tires you out thinking about all the smiles that they had to, and the hands they had to shake, and the toast, and oh my gosh. But he had to walk a fine line between basically, saying kind of what, or acting the way he wanted to, and then having to meet with some other groups that were not represented in most of the German-American community, who were fanatically pro-Nazi. And it was awkward. Like, for instance, he wouldn't give the Nazi salute and that kind of thing, and that was noted. Good. And so it was, it's the kind of thing. When I was reading about and learning about Echner, it just seemed like this is the kind of thing. It's just like, I could see something like that. It's real life if you're in a dictatorship.
Well, the Dr. Sky experience continues here.
I don't know. It must have been really tough.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the Dr. Sky experience continues here on Talk Radio 77 WABC. Our special guest, as you're hearing, and proud to call him a friend, is David Hanna. The book, Broken Icarus, the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, the Golden Age of Aviation, and the Rise of Fascism. Let's spend a few moments as we move toward the end of this interview, sad to say, and hopefully we can do this in a much longer interview as time permits in the future. But let's talk about, if you think that the aviation side of Italo Balbo is fascinating, and it is, and Ugo Echner, of course, with our talking about Zeppelins, let's talk about the Picards and moving on to the stratosphere and the connection to this particular World's Fair in Chicago. It's a great story.
What, in a few words, is the message you are carrying to the American people, Professor?
I will tell what this world looks like from 10 miles off. I will tell about the stratosphere. The stratosphere is a 6-hour route between New York and Paris. It will soon be opened to traffic. It may point the way to universal brotherhood and eternal peace. I hope so. Strife is often caused by misunderstanding. Rapid transportation between the two hemispheres will settle minor disputes. I hope a neutral flag will be hoisted in the stratosphere to prevent it ever being used to military purposes. The intercontinental highway linking the old and the new worlds holds the promise of mutual goodwill and confidence. When they are only 6 hours apart, the estranging power of space will be overcome. Europe and America will be next-door neighbors. They will drop in on each other and settle their trouble over a cup of tea.
Yeah, this is really, in many ways, my favorite part. So this is the beginning of space exploration, and it starts with trying to determine the source of cosmic rays and having them measured by actual scientists using instruments on the basically we're talking on the edge of outer space. And this goes back to some of the debates going on in physics at the time. And the first person to essentially see the Earth from the edge of outer space was Auguste Piccard. He's a physicist from Switzerland. Yes. He had a twin brother, and they'd been interested in ballooning since they were kids. So they had, one thing I like about the Piccards, the brothers, is that they're a really great example of men of science. But Jean Piccard, who was his Auguste's twin, was a chemist, was that they were men of science, but they also were men of action. They wanted to do it themselves. Their father had encouraged this. And I think this is a really good message for young people today, that, the best science is the type that you're actually, going out and experimenting yourself and learning through trial and error, and to a certain degree taking risks. And this is something that I really admire about the Piccards, that they were willing to do this. Anyway, Auguste was the first, and then he eventually repeated it in Europe, and the fair's organizers he'd become very famous, and they wanted him to come and do another launch to get the altitude record from Chicago. But he wasn't interested in doing that, but he said, my brother is living in the United States. He was working in R&D, and his wife actually was from a prominent Chicago family, Jeanette Ridlin. And they actually had met at the University of Chicago when she was a grad student. He was a professor there. Anyway, they were working with him, but they were never really keen. And eventually, they decided that they were going to have a Navy man do it, Tex Settle. And the first launch from Soldier Field, where the Bears play now, was really a fiasco. There's no business launching a balloon of that size. It was,
I never knew they even did it there. I learned something by reading your book. Yeah.
Yeah, the story's tall, and eventually it caught on some wires, and actually he was fortunate that it wasn't a disaster, because not only it was so close also to the fairgrounds. They eventually did break the record. And then he had a co-pilot, Chester Fordney, later in 1933, but they didn't do it actually from the fairgrounds. But the Piccards had insisted, because they had been the people behind the design of the capsule in particular, but also the balloon. Their know-how, working with Dow Chemical, Union Carbide, and some of these other corporations. And the Piccards had insisted that, look, once you're done with it, meaning the fair, Century of Progress as it's called, we want it, as long as it's still usable. Well, it was still usable. And so what happened is that Jean Piccard and his wife, Jeanette Piccard, then wanted to go and make a attempt at a stratosphere record, altitude record into the stratosphere, sure, while also conducting experiments based on this research into cosmic rays that was being done by Arthur Hawley Compton and Robert Millikan. And the problem was, of course, Well, actually, not of course, rather, but the problem was that Jean Piccard didn't have a balloon license in the United States, even though he'd flown balloons in Europe with his brother. And so, he took the science in very seriously. And it was going to require a lot of attention. And Jeanette Piccard, his wife, was like, I'll do it. And now, this is a time when having a female aviatrix, as they were called,
that wasn't the normal thing, right?
Yeah, you had Bessie Coleman, you had Amelia Earhart. It wasn't seen as so strange. But the problem was she was a mother. Had a bunch of young sons. And, for instance, Dow Chemical, like, no, we don't want our label on it, on the gondola. The National Geographic, who they hoped was going to help sponsor it, had cold feet. And it really was the fact that she was a mother. They thought, no, you're taking tremendous risks. What you're doing could kill you very easily. And she basically, her feeling was that, what kind of message does that send to our sons? That here we have a chance to further the field of sort of the edge of outer space in terms of exploration and science. And, we don't want them to be afraid. We want them to be innovators, risk takers, doing it themselves. And this is a chance for us to show that. And so then her sons actually took part in the launch. What happened was that even though she was from Chicago, they ultimately weren't able to get the backing there, but Henry Ford stepped in. And Henry Ford, through his connections in Detroit, was able to get backing from various companies. There was a radio company, for instance. There was an outfitting company. He also was able to call on Orville Wright to come and provide oversight for her training as a balloon pilot. So these guys, Wright and Ford, were very progressive in terms of essentially, I guess we would call it just empowering women. It's interesting because Ford is one of these guys. There's things about him that are very admirable, and others, like his anti-Semitism, which are very distasteful to say the least.
Exactly.
But in this regard, he really was very progressive. And with their help and the help of some other folks that Jean Piccard had worked with in R&D, they were able to get this effort together. And they eventually set a record, not for the overall record, which for altitude, but for a woman, and they were in the top 5 when they had made the ascent. And she held that record until the Soviet cosmonaut Tereshkova broke it in 1963.
David, that's an amazing story. I know we're coming to the end of our time with you today, but sadly to say that. But I just wanted to give you the floor. The moment here, the question that I always ask every guest is, in this particular case, give us in your words the meaning of this book that the people I think out there would want to get, and the power of this book. How would you summarize the whole theme of this book, and what would you say?
I think that we need, as a society, to keep pushing ourselves. I think instead of looking inward, we need to try to keep looking outward. I think the opening words to the Gene Roddenberry television series Star Trek, and Roddenberry as a kid was fascinated by the fair, even though he never actually went. He read everything he could about it out in Los Angeles when he was a kid. To boldly go where no man has gone before, to seek out new life. That's our heritage from Icarus. And even though, again, that particular generation was arguably broken, if you look at World War II and the Holocaust, I think that that is something that we can still inspire us and should inspire us. And I think something like, for instance, a manned voyage to Mars is something that I think we should be. I think there's a value in that for us as a society, and to put it in really broad terms, just as humans, I really think we need to push ourselves. And I think that era, the early 30s, is an inspirational period, but also a cautionary tale where it can get hijacked by people like the Nazis, what they did with the Zeppelin project.
Well, you say it so well, and the namesake of the book, Broken Icarus, comes from the statue that you write about and show us, Gustinas Ambrosi. But 2 quotes that are in the book that I wanted to pass on, and then we want to say thank you until next time. And this, again, is Jeanette Piccard. And I quote, "When you fly a balloon, you don't file a flight plan. You go where the wind goes, you feel like a part of the air. You almost feel like part of eternity, and you just float along," end quote. And then summarizing the entire century of progress, who better than William Randolph Hearst, who said this, and I quote, "The century of progress is ahead of us and not behind us," end quote. David Hanna, I want to thank you so much. The book, of course, Broken Icarus. You can get the book, ladies and gentlemen, wherever good books are sold. Prometheus Books. And I wish you and yours the best of a holiday season of joy and happiness and health, and a Merry Christmas. Please stay on the line with us as we go to the heartbreak here, as we continue to talk here on the Dr. Sky Experience, on America's iconic radio station. That is Talk Radio 77 WABC, out of New York City and around the world, and heard on the internet at WABCRadio.com. Thank you so much to author David Hanna.